Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. My name is Ginevra Morse. I am the Chief Learning and Interpretation Officer here at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncovers the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Country houses are powerful symbols of national identity, evoking the glamorous world of the landowning aristocracy. Jewish country houses, properties that were owned, built, or renewed by Jews, tell a more complex story of prejudice and integration, difference, and connection. Drawing on the first book to explore this history, our speakers today will shed new light on the world of the Jewish country house. And this installment of our Art and Architecture webinar series was made possible by the generous support of an anonymous donor. Now, our presenters today are Juliet Carey, Senior Curator at Waddesdon Manor, and Abigail Green, prize-winning author and historian at Oxford University. They are the editors of the new book entitled Jewish Country Houses, published by Brandeis University Press. You can purchase a copy of the book at the Brandeis University Press website, Amazon, or through your local bookshop. So please join me in welcoming Juliet and Abigail.
Thank you very much, Ginevra. Before I start, I just want to say this is an exciting moment for me and Juliet because it's our first Zoom talk and our first talk to an American audience. So we hope you enjoy it. And I should also explain that this is a project which speaks to things that we were perhaps only vaguely aware of as we grew up in households that mixed Jewishness, Englishness, Europe, and art in different ways. So it is a project which is quite personal to us. But at the same time, it's the outcome of a large-scale collaborative research project based at Oxford and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the University of Oxford, and the National Trust. So if you bother to count and you buy the book, you will find no less than 17 authors involved in its making. And I particularly want to give a shout out to Jacqueline Granick, because she is American, and talking to Jacqueline as we made this book has helped us to see that both country houses and Jewish histories resonate differently in the US. We call them country houses, but you often speak of country homes. In the past, Americans even called mansions summer cottages. We talk about heritage, but you sometimes talk about public history or use heritage to mean something more intangible. And the Holocaust, which even in Britain feels quite close, was an ocean away. Not that American Jews were unaffected by that history, but they were affected in a different way. This is a book that puts Jewish history and art history into conversation. And we're going to try and give you a sense of this through our joint presentation. It's also a book which encourages you to travel, and we hope you may be able to visit some of these amazing places. But even if you can't, we hope that hearing about the houses in this book from our 17 authors will enable you to travel vicariously. Juliet.
Thank you. I have always been suspicious of the cult of the country house, a particularly English phenomenon, and I'm sure though you're all familiar with Downton Abbey. Though it is an endlessly fascinating phenomenon, and many are beguiled by the comforting, nostalgic idea, in many ways a fiction, of the real country house, so intimately tied to a particular locality and community that it seems to grow organically out of the landscape, about rootedness, continuity, and paternalism, about national identity and belonging. Our book challenges this with stories of houses owned, built, or renewed by Jews, which tell a more complex story of mobility, of emigration and arrival, prejudice and integration, difference and connection. Houses and families that span and connect across the whole of Europe and beyond. The book consciously plays with the tradition of the country house book, but it is not a celebratory coffee table book treasures of somewhere, the magnificence of some dynasty. In some ways, it is in the tradition of Marc Girouard's groundbreaking social history of country houses, Life in the English Country House, which was published in 1978. And we use the proportions of his later Life in the French Country House as the basis for the shape of our book. But its exact form was dictated by the dimensions of Hélène Binet's photographs. And this is Nymans, the gardens of Nymans in Sussex. These marvelous photographs challenge many conventions of country house photography. This slide shows some of the covers, the next slide, please, shows some of the covers of a suitcase full of country house books that we took to Abigail's literary agent when we first pitched the book. What we wanted our book not to be like. For example, those familiar covers with a splendid edifice across the middle in beige or grey, with a green sward below and blue sky above. We commissioned Hélène, one of the world's leading photographers, to photograph some of the houses in the book. They are not illustrations to the text, but form a narrative in their own right. These two are Nymans again. Hélène selected them and grouped them, often in surprising and very telling pairs, and her photographs give the book its fundamental visual rhythm. They immerse us and lead us through spaces. Sometimes they give us pause. They are full of the movement of the seasons. This is the Liebermann Villa outside Berlin. They tease out unexpected connections between houses. This is Waddesdon on the left and the Villa Liebermann again on the right. They tell us so much about being in the spaces, and they hold many layers of human experience, even though not one of the photographs has people in it. This is the Villa Tugendhat. They are about loss as well as about life. This is Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, the house I know best and one of the most visited of National Trust houses, seen through Hélène's lens. It's a Victorian hotel of a house that looks from the outside like a French Renaissance chateau, and inside is stuffed full of architectural elements from real 18th century buildings and works of art, notably the English portraits, French decorative arts, and the kind of medieval and Renaissance treasure cabinet wonders, particularly associated with German taste. Waddesdon was built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild of the Austrian branch of the banking family, born in Paris, raised in Frankfurt and Vienna, who settled and married in England. Here on the left is him in modern dress, and on the right, dressed up for the Devonshire House ball as a Protestant Renaissance prince. He built the house as a stage for his art collection, a setting for lavish entertaining, and a launch pad for his political career. Through the careful integration of architecture and works of art, through which he played with the past and with his complex cultural identity, Ferdinand fashioned himself as a modern collector and a pan-European prince. Abigail.
I'm going to set Waddesdon against a house that is much less well known, Eastcliff Lodge, home of Sir Moses Montefiore on the outskirts of Ramsgate. And you can see it here, rather romanticised by Turner. Superficially, this site seems to tell a very different story. Eastcliff wasn't a bling French-style chateau, but an early example of neo-Gothic English architecture. The house was destroyed, but its early glass houses remain, as does the synagogue, which you can see here. It recalls a Regency town house. The Lady Judith Montefiore Theological College, which you see here as part of the wider synagogue complex, is now lost, but it in fact looked like a lot of other red brick Victorian institutions of higher education. Only the mausoleum feels foreign. It is modelled on the tomb of Rachel near Bethlehem. This is a place which feels unapologetically Jewish, in contrast to Waddesdon, which Jewish visitors in particular often read as a site of assimilation. Importantly, it was both publicly and privately Jewish. Images of the Montefiore Sukkah were disseminated in the illustrated press. This is the example of that. It's from a contemporary journal. But if we think more deeply about these two houses, we can see that they share a common history because they belong to families that were related. And because they were both, in very different ways, Jewish homes. As rich Jews, their owners occupied a particular place in British, European and Jewish society. The Rothschilds and the Montefioris were lay leaders of the Jewish community. They engaged in international Jewish philanthropy. They moved in aristocratic circles, and they figured in anti-Semitic cartoons like this one, in which the Jews, an anti-national element, are conspiring at a key moment in the struggle against Napoleon to drug the king's messengers so they can make a killing to the public's disadvantage. And I chose this particular image because all the figures in it were country house owners, and it includes Nathan Rothschild and Moses Montefiore. But we could also consider this one. Next slide. The frontispiece of W.T. Stead's Christmas novella, The Splendid Paupers, which is centrally preoccupied with the theme of Jews buying up the great castles and estates of Britain. I hope the point is clear. We aren't attempting to create a typology of Jewish country houses, nor to identify a particular style of country house that was in some way Jewish. Instead, we argue that the Jewishness of these houses is relational. It's about the relationship of their owners to non-Jewish society, which was distinctive, and it's about the relationship of their owners to Jewish society, which was distinctive as well. Let me elaborate. All religious minorities experienced inequality, but the position of Jews as a pan-European non-Christian minority was exceptional. Only in the Netherlands was Jewish settlement and land ownership unconstrained and apparently uncontroversial before the French Revolution. Well into the 19th century, Jews elsewhere were precluded from owning real estate except in rare and anomalous situations. In Italy, most Jews were still confined to urban ghettos, just as they were in Central European cities like Frankfurt and Prague. Elsewhere, from Alsace-Lorraine across to Russia, Jewish residents remained contingent, sometimes permitted, always highly regulated, and often prohibited altogether. And we forget that in Britain too, the right of Jews to own freehold property was uncertain before 1831 and maybe even as late as 1846. In retrospect, this appears a minor matter, but to contemporaries it was no such thing, because in 18th and 18th century Britain, citizenship, political rights and property ownership went hand in hand. Two of the houses in our book tell that story. If Hughenden Manor is a National Trust property, then that's because Disraeli has long been a household name, the father of what we call one nation conservatism and Britain's first and only Jewish Prime Minister. Except he wasn't quite that. Because Disraeli's father Isaac, a literary man who rented a gracious Queen Anne house close to Hughenden, fell out with his synagogue Bevis Marks over a trivial financial matter. Benjamin was baptized at the age when he should have become bar mitzvah. Had he remained Jewish, he could never have been an MP at that time, let alone leader of a rump Tory party. For a Tory politician, this background was eccentric. He was permanently broke, and he likely entered Parliament to avoid a debtor's prison. But as Tory leader, he could not operate without a country house. So the party grandees clubbed together to help him buy one. Disraeli became the most powerful man in Britain, if not the world. Yet no one, not Queen Victoria, who adored him, nor Bismarck, with whom he famously negotiated, forgot for a moment that he was a Jew. We find the delicacy of that synthesis preserved at Hughenden, which you see here, where portraits of his Jewish family hang alongside grander paintings of his powerful friends, and in the library, which you see here, which he inherited from his father, the contents, that is, not the room. The Salomons estate near Tunbridge Wells, which you see in this 1868 photograph, is a very different proposition. It's now a sprawling hotel and events venue in which 2 rooms only have been preserved as a family shrine. So it feels very personal, unlike most National Trust properties. And it feels very much more Jewish, with synagogue vestments like this one, coming up now, preserved behind glass, and even a treasured fragment of the Kotel, better known as the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. So this is a house that tells many stories about men who led public lives and the women who loved, lost, and celebrated them. The most prominent of those men is Sir David Salomons, the first Jewish Lord Mayor of London and one of the heroes of the long battle for Jewish emancipation. Unlike Disraeli, Salomons did not convert. When he was elected to Parliament in the early 1850s, he could not take his seat as an MP because he refused to swear an oath on the true faith of a Christian. But he did enter Parliament and become the first Jew to speak in it, and you can find the bench from which he was forcibly ejected here at the Salomons estate. So this is not just a British story. We found stories like these all over Europe, and our book tells some of them. Indeed, I would argue that Jewish country houses were as much a hallmark of the age of emancipation as the grand so-called cathedral synagogues which began to appear across Europe in precisely the same period. Let's think for a moment about Lower Austria. Before the Constitution of 1867, Jews had been barred from living in Lower Austria at all. 10 years later, the Austrian Rothschilds owned a third of the entire Crown land, including massive tracts of forest. Just as the British Rothschilds dominated the Vale of Aylesbury, so the Austrian Rothschilds sprinkled this Rothschild Viertel, or Rothschild Quarter, as it was called, with their houses, and in due course it became a crucible for both socialist and Catholic anti-Semitism. Or we might think of Walter Rathenau, an industrialist and aesthete who had been barred from serving as a reserve officer in the Prussian army because he was Jewish. Rathenau was famously ambivalent about his Jewishness, like many people in our book. When he eventually became Germany's first and only Jewish foreign minister in the aftermath of the First World War, he left the form declaring his religion blank because, he said, it was no longer relevant. Certainly, he knew exactly what it meant for him as a Jew to buy the little Prussian royal palace of Fallingwater and restore it to something like its 18th century perfection. When the court asked him to return the Prussian crown that still stood on the flagpole, he refused. So perhaps it's not surprising that Fallingwater became a central theme in the anti-Semitic attacks on Rathenau before his 1922 assassination. When the libelous rumour circulated that he had set a sculpture above the gate of his Berlin mansion featuring the crowned heads of Europe in a sacrificial bowl. Now, this may seem to be a very German story, but we could note that the mausoleum in which Rathenau was buried, which you see here, had been designed by Alfred Messel, whose brother owned Nymans, one of the English properties in our book. Connections like these are not a coincidence, but rather a feature of the book, just as they were a feature of the milieu it describes. Juliet.
Thank you. Sometimes these pan-European connections are familial. When Ferdinand de Rothschild was preparing to build Waddesdon, and here is one of my favourite shots of the exterior wall, Rothschild asked to know the heights above sea level of all the other Rothschild houses in the Vale of Aylesbury, Rothschildshire, as it was sometimes called. Mentmore, designed by Joseph Paxton of Crystal Palace fame, was the most spectacular of the houses with which other members of the family competed. And this competitive conversation between different houses in different places moves us into Europe, to Ferrières, for example, near Paris, in Seine-et-Marne, shown here with people hunting and with its aviary in a lithograph of 1870. Ferrières was built by Ferdinand de Rothschild's great-uncle James, called by anti-Semites Rothschild I, King of the Jews. Like Mentmore, Ferrières was designed by Joseph Paxton. There were very private spaces, a little oratory opposite the smoking room. Here's the smoking room. There's no image of the little oratory. And the French painter Eugène Lamy, who contributed to the decoration, conjured up the house as a place of private sociability in a wonderful series of watercolors. But the giganticist spectacle of a palace was really a very public statement about the status of the Rothschilds. Ferrières had a very different kind of posterity from Waddesdon. During the war, the Rothschilds were stripped of their French nationality, and the Nazis recognized Ferrières' emblematic nature, and it was occupied by German troops. the works of art seized and sent to Bavaria. It is a sad place to visit now, officially an historical monument owned by the University of Paris, but actually rather desolate, in what one member of the family called a sad, dreamless sleep. I want to show you some of the other houses that the book encompasses as we follow our story of Jews and their country houses into waterside villas, agricultural estates, and semi-rural enclaves. There is even an American postscript that considers how Americans adopted some of those European archetypes, each with their particular European histories and connotations, and made those traditions their own. From Rhode Island cottages, here's the beaches in Newport, Rhode Island around 1875, where the Jewish American poet Emma Lazarus spent the summers with her family, to Otto Kahn's OHEKA Castle on Long Island here in the 1920s, the aerial shot, to Fallingwater in Pennsylvania, built for the Pittsburgh department store millionaire Edgar Jonas Kaufman and his wife Lillian, here seen rather at leisure, beautiful leisure on the terrace. But to give you a sense of the range of the European houses that make up the main matter of the book, this is Villa Carolus in Beaulieu-sur-Mer on the French Riviera, surely one of the loveliest libraries on earth. A turn of the century reimagining of an ancient Greek villa built by the Jewish architect Emmanuel Pomeroli for Theodor Reinach, archaeologist, lawyer, politician, and prominent Dreyfusard. Carolus is a deeply erudite private retreat, expressive of the humanist and Jewish ideals of its creator, who was the founder of French liberal Judaism. On the right is the floor of the library, the mosaics on the floor. Villa La Montesca in Umbria is at the centre of an agricultural estate, and it was built by an Italian liberal politician, an agricultural reformer, and his American wife, with an extraordinary array of styles, the cultural high points of the recently united nation of Italy, from the Pietra Serena arcades of the Brunelleschian Renaissance to the flamboyantly Baroque illusionistic ceilings. There were botanical gardens, and under the aegis of Alice Franchetti, the house was a site of educational innovation when Maria Montessori set up a school there, and of the revival and teaching of traditional crafts. I particularly love this photograph by Hélène of the looms, the weaving looms. This, Villa Liebermann, is the studio house and lakeside retreat of the German painter Max Liebermann on Lake Wannsee, just outside Berlin. Liebermann died in 1935. In 1940, his widow Martha was forced to sell the house to the German Reich, and in 1943, she killed herself rather than be deported the next day to Theresienstadt. Villa Tugendhat, overlooking Brno in what is now the Czech Republic, is one of the most famous buildings in the world, Mies van der Rohe's modernist masterpiece for one of the city's most prominent Jewish textile families. Amazingly, Hélène Binet had not photographed it before, and her response proved particularly revelatory. The new perspective of our book presents the house in, we hope, a surprising and refreshing way, as the culmination of a Habsburg chapter that follows the Royal Kaiser Ferdinand's Northern Railway, built to link Vienna with the mines in the north, a great industrial leap forward in which Jewish entrepreneurs have played a major role, and which means the Villa Tugendhat is considered in the context of industry and luxury with other quite different houses, including the Rothschilds' palatial Schillersdorf and the Gutmanns' remodeled Renaissance castle of Tobitschau. Politics come in here too. An aristocratic style was appropriate for Jews living in the Habsburg Empire, but ceased to be so once they found themselves living in the new Czechoslovak Republic. The Tugendhats' enjoyment of their extraordinary house was brief. They were forced to emigrate when the Nazis closed in on Czechoslovakia, traveling in the opposite direction along the railway that would carry most of Brno's large Jewish population to their deaths. For obvious reasons, few remain of the many, many Jewish country houses that our project identified in Eastern Europe, partly a product of the Holocaust, but also the legacies of war and communism. This is an image of just one of them from a years core book, a type of book this I did not know about before this project, commemorating Jewish communities lost in the Shoah. Trent Park, near Enfield in England, not so far out at the edge of London really, links a Jewish country house in Britain with what was happening in Europe in a dark but captivating way. Sir Philip Sassoon, who you see on the left, had turned an old country, if you go back, please, had turned an old house into the epitome of a particular idea of the English country house. And during the war, its country house atmosphere was key to a crucial intelligence gathering initiative when Britain's top-ranking Nazi prisoners of war were flattered by the aristocratic ambiance and lulled into a false sense of security in its drawing rooms and parkland. But everything was bugged. The light fittings, the pictures, the trees in the gardens, and the prisoners' talk was recorded by secret listeners in the basement, many of whom were German Jews. This is Eric Mark, one of the secret listeners who gathered thousands of pages of transcripts about military plans and codes and about the murder of Jews in camps and killing sites all over Europe. Eric Marks recalled, most of them liked to boast about how many Jews they had killed, which was tough for me to take, being a Jew. Trent Park is currently being turned into luxury flats, but with a museum telling its wartime story. Abigail.
In Britain, of course, country houses remain important symbols of the national past, and the National Trust, which is, in fact, the largest voluntary organisation in Europe, preserves many and has contributed to that reality. Our book writes Jewishness back into their stories. Many other houses which have not been helped by the National Trust, like Eastcliff and Worth Park, home of the Sussex Montefiores, have been lost to posterity. This is quite a complicated story. I'll be happy to say more about it. But what I want to do is to hone in on one example, which is particularly emblematic. In the early 1970s, the Rothschild Palace of Mentmore, which we saw earlier, was the best preserved Victorian house in the country and boasted a collection that rivaled that of the Queen. But when Mentmore and its contents were offered to the nation at a knockdown price, the nation chose not to save it. 1973, of course, was a difficult year for many reasons, and the economic and political crisis was likely the most compelling factor. But there is something rather chilling about the terms in which Duff Cooper, Viscount Norwich, made the case for Mentmore to the House of Lords. He said this, "It is not in any way characteristic, it is not typical, it represents the international banker's Jewish taste of the Rothschilds. But surely, my lord, it is not the worse for that. What we are discussing is the fact that here we have superb works of art which infinitely transcend the narrow bounds of Englishness or of any other country. Great art belongs to the world." Our book aims to unpick the assumptions that underlie this argument, both the anti-Semitic conception of Jewish taste and a sense that houses like Mentmore were cuckoos in the national nest. But it also reminds us of things it is easy to forget, of the dream of belonging that preceded the Shoah, and of the many ways in which British and European Jewish history converged up to that moment, which marked a seismic break, not just in the history of the Jews, but also in the relationship between Britain and the continent. All the houses we focus on in this book are open to the public, and most are easy to visit. Having spent much of the past 10 years talking to the staff and volunteers who work in them, we hope that if you find yourselves in Europe, you will do just that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both, Juliet and Abigail, for that fascinating presentation. We will get to your questions. Everyone listening, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A panel. But before we get to your questions, we do have some upcoming programs that I'd like to mention. So on February 21st, Robert O'Byrne will discuss his new book, The Irish Country House, A New Vision. And then on February 28th, Kurt DiCamillo will present on J.P. Morgan, Banker, Collector, Renaissance Prince. And then on March 20th, be sure to join us for Der Schustermann, a conversation between shoe designer and fashion icon Stuart Weitzman and historian Jonathan Sarna on the history of the Jewish shoe industry in America. You can register for all of these events on our website at americanancestors.org/events. You'll also receive registration links in the follow-up email to today's presentation. And I do want to mention that that final event featured on this slide on the March 20th, all of the proceeds of that event will benefit the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center here at American Ancestors. We also have some upcoming heritage tours that I want to share. So this May, we'll be offering our first ever heritage tour designed specifically for book lovers, The Power of Story and the Land of Enchantment, in which Margaret Talcott, our producer of the American Inspiration series, will be your guide at the renowned Santa Fe International Literary Festival, as well as to local literary sites and Taos. And then in June, join us for our Splendors of Saxony tour with Kurt DiCamillo. And I should mention that space in both of these tours is limited. So be sure to register soon, and you can learn more at americanancestors.org/events. So let's get to some questions, and I'll ask both Juliet and Abigail to turn on their video, and we can answer some questions.
Amazing program you've got. It's so
It is. I'm rather jealous.
Yes.
Well, I hope maybe you'll be able to join us.
Amazing.
So we have a question from Patricia, who asks or says, I'll be visiting Oxford this summer for a few days. Can you recommend a country house to visit from that location?
Waddesdon is not very far away. And Hughenden, I would say, Waddesdon and Hughenden for Jewish country houses, and there are many others.
There's a third which you could visit, which is Upton House.
Oh yes, of course, Upton is not so far away either.
Great suggestions. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how your process for researching, working with all the various authors. Can you give us a sense, how long did this project take before the book was published?
Well, this is a 10-year project. I mean, it's taken a long time, and we've held a lot of conferences, as you probably saw. And I suppose the first couple of conferences allowed us really to identify case study chapters where there are people who could write about them and interesting stories. But subsequent conferences allowed us to flesh out themes and ideas, which enabled us to write the introduction and to bring it all together in a completely different way. I think something we really hadn't expected when we started out. Do you want to say anything more, Juliet?
No, I think that rather sums it up. I mean, when we made the selection of case studies to focus on, as Abigail said, it was partly obviously a range of stories and having the right people to write, in their different voices engagingly. But we also very much wanted the houses to be accessible so that people could be stimulated by the book to then go and discover them themselves. So they are mostly easy to access.
But at the same time, not all of them are well known. So the British houses are quite well known, but the house on the cover, the Villa Montesca, is, I think, very little known. So there are some real surprises in here as well.
And why do you, I mean, maybe you could speak a little bit more about what kind of research had been done prior to the book on Jewish country houses, and maybe, why has it taken maybe so long for us to examine and really understand the complexities of Jewish country houses?
I suppose just for the first part of that question, perhaps I can answer it. There were some books focusing on individual houses, like a big glossy book about Waddesdon, or for example, books about the buildings by one family, buildings and collections, for example, associated with the Sassoons or with the Rothschilds, that kind of thing. But really it hadn't been looked at as a category. I think particularly there's a really big kind of cult of the country house is such an English phenomenon, and there's a big kind of industry of research and visiting and writing about country houses. But I think, as I suggested at the beginning of my first bit of talking just now, it's so much associated with a particular idea of Englishness, and it's about dynasty and rootedness and being there for centuries. And so people just didn't, Jewish country houses didn't fit that model. And in some cases, I think the Jewishness of certain houses was sort of underplayed, and sometimes, even something to be kind of pushed aside a bit and kind of played down for kind of nasty reasons. But also, it's just that they didn't, their stories, the stories of these big pan-European networks and completely sort of different aspects of their history, meant that they just weren't seen in the narratives that people tended to go for when describing the significance of country houses. But Abigail will want to say.
Well, I just wanted to add a bit more to that final point, actually, because in country house studies, to have a properly European book like this I mean, in fact, there are some which are kind of, greatest hits of the European country house, but to really think about a phenomenon in a way which compares different national contexts, but also makes sense because it is part of a singular phenomenon. I mean, this is just something which is actually very difficult to do and only probably possible to do in a collaborative way. I mean, something else I think which is quite distinctive about the book is that quite a number of the authors are continental Europeans, and we helped translate the work into English. So it's also about bringing a completely different set of sensibilities and knowledge base really into the literature in English about the country house.
It's been terribly refreshing for us. I mean, it's one of the reasons that the National Trust, for example, I think was so excited by the project and the book, because it did refresh ways of looking at British country houses by looking at them in this bigger European context. And I mean, it was a
and America,
sort of different historians, kind of European historians writing from a completely different point of view. It's been a revelation.
We have another question. Lawrence asks, do the owners of the publicly accessible British houses, such as the National Trust, do they pay much attention to the Jewish history of the houses? How is that shown in kind of the interpretation of the homes?
Well, one of the things we're most proud of in the project has been that although some houses have always been interested and aware of the Jewishness in their Jewish stories, some of them very much weren't. And so the research and the book have really made an impact on the interpretation, which, it's changing all the time, improving, kind of, layering it into the stories that are told. And for the project, part of that, we got a wonderful big research grant from the British government, from the Arts and Humanities Research Council, to do the research. And some of that money, a lot, really significant part of that work was to train, was to pay people to train the guides and the curators and all sorts of staff at some of the houses, particularly the National Trust houses, so that the guides became sort of confident and informed enough to speak about these newly understood layers of those histories. Sorry, that was rather ramblingly put.
Yeah, I think I want to also give a special shout out to the chapter about Hughenden by Rob Bandy. So Rob is actually the house manager at Hughenden, and I think he would be the first to say that when we started talking to him about Hughenden and Disraeli's Jewishness, it was very hard. I remember him saying it was everywhere and nowhere in the house, but for the visitor, to be frank, it was nowhere. And they experimented with an exhibition, and they discovered that they assumed people knew Disraeli was Jewish, but in fact, this was not the case. So now as a result of the project and of course writing the chapter, and it shows in the chapter the work that they've been doing. People who go to Hughenden will be very much made aware of the Jewish aspects of Disraeli's story, and everybody is very keen to talk about it. So it's a very different situation than when we first started working with them.
There are many volunteers. They're oversubscribed for people to give the story, the tours about it as a Jewish house, which is really fascinating and wonderful.
Um, Joan asks, why was the focus of the book based on Jewish homes? I mean, I think, we could probably do, there could be similar books about any number of either religious backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds. Um, why Jewish homes in particular?
Well, it's really about Jewish country houses. And
Hmm.
so that's the starting point. And in Europe, the country house has a particular place in social hierarchies. And Jews, too, had a particular place in social hierarchies, which was different from that of Catholics, for example. So you could do something about Catholic houses in Britain, which are very different from other houses. But of course, there are a lot of Catholics who own country houses all over Europe. It's not really a very distinctive category. But because Jews in most parts of Europe couldn't own land until the 19th century, they had to convert if they entered the aristocracy. This phenomenon, the Jewish country house, was part of the struggle for emancipation, and that gives it a very different weight. Of course, you can tell lots of different stories about country houses. And in Britain, for example, a lot of work now goes into talking about histories of slavery and colonialism in the context of the country house. But the Jewish story is distinctive. Um, and I think it's also true to say that the National Trust, for example, has actually quite a lot of houses with Jewish stories. So it was an important missing part of the overall narrative. But Juliet might have further things to say.
Yeah, no, I think you've said it all. I mean, they, because of this thing of Jews not being able to own land until the 19th century, mostly, as we've said in other contexts, there's something transgressive about these houses, and it is a very, very particular thing. It is a
And
big thing.
since owning land often brought political rights, if you were fighting for political rights, then you needed to be able to own land.
Mm.
The emancipation allowed you to build them, but it also stated it stated emancipation. It was very much about it. They go hand in hand.
And is this an ongoing project? I mean, are you continuing to look at, newer Jewish country homes or houses and are more kind of coming out of the woodwork because of, so to speak, because of the publication of the book, or
We've got a spreadsheet already with many, many.
so there needs to be a part two.
Well, I feel that the heritage work has been done quite well now and in Britain, but there is, I think, much, there are now other countries coming forward, like Italy, which are keen to think more about their country houses. So, in that sense, it's kind of started a broader movement, but it's not necessarily going to involve Juliet and me.
You've inspired future generations and,
Yeah.
to look more broadly into this. Um, You mentioned a few Jewish architects, or at least one in the presentation and in the book. Was that ever a focus of your research, looking at Jewish architects and craftsmen during this period?
You mentioned Messel, who's a
Mm.
German architect, and Paul Meroli of Kerelos. But we at the beginning, a lot of people assumed that what we were doing was looking for houses that were designed by Jewish architects. So for us, it was about who actually owned the houses or lived in them or revived them, rather than it being about Jews as architects, which is something people have written about
Hmm.
in other contexts and in the past. I mean, it is a story within it. Some houses, very consciously. Um, clearly the patrons have wanted a Jewish architect, sometimes not, and sometimes the houses already existed.
And you also mentioned, of course, the loss of Jewish country houses, especially in Eastern Europe. We throughout the series, we often talk about the loss of English country houses. And at some period, it seemed, there would be a loss of a house every couple of weeks. Um, were there, can you talk about kind of, and we showed, I think, a few examples of Jewish country houses that are no longer in existence. Um, in Britain in particular, did
But I mean,
you? Oh, go ahead.
there are not, you know, the loss of the houses is to do with, you know, changing tax regimes and the fact that people couldn't afford or want servants anymore. It's to do with sort of socioeconomics. In Europe, it's to do with mass murder. You know, and that there's it's the Holocaust, and then in Far Eastern Europe, communism. So that there are completely different. I mean, it's a completely different production to talk about
Yes,
the
of course.
Europe is
But
very
what I
different.
would say, I mean, one of the things we come across is the fact that many of these houses, because of the era in which they were built, reflect a kind of like Ferrières, for example, or Bletchley Park, were built in a kind of elaborate, rather, you know, style which appeared vulgar and was not much appreciated at precisely the moment that people were trying to work out which houses to save. So Second Empire style, which is obviously Ferrières, you know, was for a long time a kind of it epitomized a certain kind of bad taste. I mean, isn't the play by Sartre, Huis Clos, actually set in a room which is Second Empire because that's what it epitomizes?
Oh, yes. And there's also, you know, and that's the case in Britain, certainly. I mean, some of the reluctance to you know, the distaste for Waddesdon and Mentmore is to do with the distaste for Victorian architecture, as well as for the other underlying things that Abigail spoke so well about. So yes, there is the 19th century phenomenon is a thing.
We also have another question from a listener. In the historical records, were there any examples that you found of anti-Semitism, you know, against the Jewish owners when they were purchasing, building, owning these homes? You know, any examples of them having to pay more for materials or barriers to ownership? We talked about, of course, there were barriers to ownership prior to even 1846. Harder to find servants. Anything like that that kind of came to light during the research period?
Yes, I mean, Abigail came up with the Rattenhauer example is particularly strong, I think, about Frauenwalder. Do you want to
But
say
we
anything?
might think also about hunting, I feel. So obviously hunting was a very important part of the rural economy and also a very important part of aristocratic social life. And I mean, the Rothschild houses in the Vale of Aylesbury and also Austria were strongly about hunting. But Juliet could say more about this, but
Yes, so
in
for
the Vale
example,
of
reasons where you get these kind of clusters, these enclaves. There are many reasons that, for example, the Rothschilds, a lot of them have their houses in the Vale of Aylesbury. It's partly because it's close to the city, it's close to London, it's convenient in all those ways. But it's also that if you have a sort of critical mass, a significant enough number of your own extended family, you can then create your own hunt, because as the Rothschilds when they first were in the Vale of Aylesbury, a lot of the traditional old aristocratic hunts wouldn't want Jews to be part of their hunts. So you need to, and yet you have to hunt if you're an aristocrat in the country in Britain in the 19th century. So they created their own hunt. I mean, that's not the case now. People, you know, lots of people hunt with lots of other people, but that's often understood to be
I don't know
part.
whether many people are hunting anymore at all in Britain, Juliet.
That's true. Whatever it is they're allowed to do. But so that's just one of the elements, one of the motivations for these. We see it a lot, these kind of enclaves of Jews in their country houses.
Lawrence asks, were there Jewish architects who were commissioned to design country houses for Gentile clients? I imagine in the 19th, early 20th century, perhaps in
I
England.
suddenly can't think what else Paul Meroli, for example, did. But yes, they did also design for non-Jewish. I mean,
Well,
Messel.
Messel, obviously.
Messel designed masses in Berlin. He did. There's a big a museum. There's I can't remember which museum. And the museum with that wonderful museum with the altar in it, the whole temple inside. I suddenly can't remember what
The
it's called.
Pergamon.
Pergamon Museum. He designed that, and also a great big department store, for example. But I haven't. I couldn't now I haven't looked into all the Jewish architects and whether they also, but they did. And there's some really quite interesting and quite transgressive things the other way round. So, for example, there's a Rothschild, one of the Rothschild castles in that part of Austria that Abigail was talking about, where Jews had absolutely not been allowed, and then suddenly after 1867, a third of it, I think, Abigail, if I remember right, was owned by the Rothschilds. One of the main houses of theirs was an old castle that was restored by the Rothschilds, but they actually used the non-Jewish architect who had just designed, who had just built or restored the main cathedral in Vienna. So that they were using not a really culturally significant architect of Christian Vienna. I think it's really intriguing.
And then, of course, there's the man who designed Amsterdam train station and the
Yes,
Rijksmuseum, who also designed Kasteel de Haar, or rather restored Kasteel de Haar, which in the Netherlands.
Yeah, and is owned by was restored by a Catholic and a Jew, a Rothschild and a Dutch Catholic, so that it was a very complicated sort of cultural presence in the Protestant Netherlands, built by an architect who had just put their stamp on modern Amsterdam.
This is perhaps a more general question. One participant says in the US, some country estate owners invited working class families or children for country retreats, often by pitching tents, having festivities and activities on their grounds. Did this happen in England at all? Was there a tradition of
there's
that?
A big tradition of sort of paternalistic engagement with the local people, with the local communities. At Waddesdon, for example, there was an annual kind of sort of fair, a sort of festival party kind of treat. It was called the Waddesdon Treat, something like that. I can't remember. But that's a big part of supply.
But there was also, I think, quite interestingly, so there was a house called Highdown Gardens, which was on the Sussex coast and belonged to the de Stern family. And they used to have, every summer, they used to have a group of Jewish children from I think the Oxford and St George's Club in the London East End. So they were Cockneys who would come and spend the summer on Highdown Hill. And it was their first real exposure to, I mean, there was, for most of these people for a generation, it was the only summer holiday they ever had, and it was their only real exposure to the countryside. So there definitely was a sense in which these houses were used in that way. But also, and we talk about this a little bit in the book, in the period around the Holocaust, they also became spaces in which kinder from the kinder transport, so children who'd been rescued from Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia in the 1930s, or concentration camp survivors were then rehabilitated in these houses. So there are some examples of concentration camp survivors in Lingfield in England, and there's a Rothschild house, I think the Château de la Guette in France, and the Warburgs had a house which was also used like this called the Villa Blancanesi. And in fact, there was a family called the Stetners who had a kind of Zionist training camp on their farm. So these houses, I guess they were also flexible spaces which could be used in that way. And I did hear anecdotally that when the Allies were retreating from Burma during the war, all the Burmese Jews took refuge in the country houses of the Sassoons in India.
Mm. Wow. Well, we're just about at time, and I think seems like we've answered everyone's questions as they've come in during the presentation. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and it is a refreshing take on the country house. And as we've kind of come to understand it. So I highly recommend, if you haven't purchased the book, take a look. You can get a copy from your local library or purchase it through the Brandeis University Press website, as well as Amazon and of course your local bookshop. If you have additional questions that you'd like me to pass on to either Abigail or Juliet, you can write to heritagetours@americanancestors.org. Thank you again for joining us. And as you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our future online programs. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.